Welcome to So What's It Actuary About? I'm your host, Margie McKechnie, and I, along with my wide array of guests, hope to help you better understand and weather the wonderful world of actuarial science. Hello, and welcome to today's episode. We are joined by our favourite star guest, Adam.
He's back.
He's back by popular demand. And today we are going to be talking about exam technique, some studying techniques, some sort of don't do's, do do's. That's a great way of explaining it. Actually, but in the don't do's around approaching actuarial exams. So I'm sort of going to open up the floor to you. What would be some of your thoughts around approaching exams, both studying the content and then that exam technique that comes with it?
So I think if you had asked younger Adam, mid-university, telling him that he would have been able to hopefully share some of the learnings that he's had from what happened in his university experience. So I think I very much approached university as my little laboratory. I think
Dexter.
Yeah, 1,000%. I often will tell my students that if you want to talk about odd sleep schedules or odd study methods, I'm your guy. I've tried everything and anything of micro sleeping to post-studying to try and enhance recall to all sorts of different study methodologies. And the biggest thing I think is first starting when thinking about how we study is about how do you study?
Yeah.
I see a lot of students get confused because they are confronted with a million different study techniques, different million ways they could go about it, and they think that they have to either do all of them or have to do it according to how someone else does it.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing is that our brain's all different. That's the beauty of all of this, is that the whole point is that the way you approach work is completely different. It's contextual, it's from your background. But the work in university, particularly I think as you're going through those later subjects, is around the strong candidates or strong exam takers know how they study, not how everyone should study. And that's the thing to focus on, I think, is around ways that we all can approach the way to figure out how we go about studying. And where do we know if something's not working?
Yeah. And what's difficult with the actuarial sort of set of exams is that you sort of have these sort of subsets, which are quite different. You have sort of the initial subsets that you engage with, which are the technical ones, right? And the way that you study for that is quite different to how you would study for actuarial risk management and your F100s and your F200s. So can you speak to sort of how you would approach that or advise someone to approach the technical subjects, and then we'll sort of go on to the more strategic ones?
Absolutely. So I have a good anecdote from my varsity times. I used to have a lovely friend I studied with, still my friend, and she in undergrad, so in your technical, your sort of A100, A200 subjects, she would always miss classes, pull an all-nighter before the test, and absolutely smashed out of the park. But that kind of stopped towards honours because the studying approach is so different, where I found it very different. And the almost opposite of that, during undergrad, I would spend a lot of more consistent time working through things or working through past examples. And then in honours, it's a very different set of skills that you're building in terms of the ability to memorize and synthesize information.
Yeah.
I often struggled with some more of the technical aspects of how do I get to this particular answer? Or why am I not able to move through the content?
Yeah.
But in honours, of that skill of trying to look at things at a high level.
Yeah.
So you're not in the detail, you're not going to get to the correct answer.
Yes.
Instead, you're trying to find where the links between concepts are.
Yeah.
So you're not moving to the object, you're looking at the relationship of this object to everything else.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably the biggest thing that if I take a step back, it's what I learned is you're moving past the point of just understanding and memorizing theorems from your undergrad, and you're now moving in your honours and your sort of later subjects, particularly the F100s and F200s, of looking at the relationships between different pieces of work. Yeah.
Very connected. And I think what students struggle with that is that they're not used to having to form those connections for themselves. I think sometimes in the technical subjects, it's easier to see that connection because you have to understand a distribution in order to, let's say, transform it.
Exactly.
Whereas, for example, in ARM, you don't necessarily understand why you need to understand expenses to connect it to reserving.
Yes.
It's not intuitive. And I think students often say to me, they're like, well, how do I connect those things? Like, and what I say to them, and it'll be interesting to see whether you agree, is I say, always start with the products. Start with the financial products, because all of those later subjects are sort of, they're framed around the actuarial control cycle.
Yeah.
But the actuarial control cycle is about products, and offerings and solutions that you are developing. And so make sure that you understand those underlying products and solutions, and then connect everything to that. So like in healthcare, if you are talking about private medical insurance, you say, okay, how does reserving link to this? How does expenses link to this? And then you create this web, but it's all based on the product.
Yes.
And you can't understand a product unless you understand a need, right? A product is useless if you don't understand the need that it meets.
Why does it exist?
Exactly. So that's generally how I advise my students to create a web.
Yes.
Because I think you have to create a web.
That's exactly it.
Because there's just too much content to learn off one night. I mean, I have students, I remember last year sitting with a student who had learned acronyms. But like, the acronyms where it's like, like a like a sentence. It's almost like an essay worth of letters or words made up of letters, which all represent something. And I was like, how do you remember this? Like,
and I mean, so in honors, that's also a big test of it is, so we're looking for sort of the understanding part of like, how do you understand how this web moves together? So the system thinking of there's an input, a process, and an output. So those are the things, the skills you actually learned in your technical subject. I also see a lot of honors students or the sort of F100, F200 level say, this isn't what we studied in undergrad, but it is what you studied in undergrad. You just looked at the maths behind it, because maths is a matter. When we build a model, we're just looking at a mathematical representation of the world. And that representation, that abstraction, applies to words as well. It's logic. It's so when we talk about like the product or that's the transformation that you're seeing. It starts with an input, a need, or where did this come from? So, and in terms of once you can understand that, the sort of nuances, your acronyms, your actual fleshy bits are almost the
embellishments.
The embellishments. They're the little shortcuts that help you get there. Your brain, the actuarial exams, we recognize that like people are smart. We're probably one of the top 3 in your class in high school. You've obviously done well in order to get to the F100 level. There's less than 2,000 qualified actuaries. So in terms of the number that start versus end, the further up you go, the tougher it's going to get.
It kind of bottlenecks a little bit.
Exactly. And so the idea being of, well, then how do you show adequate demonstration of education and understanding? Well, the one thing is to go and test a large body of knowledge and to test it in practical ways, which is largely infeasible to try and get someone qualified. So the other way to do it is to put a time constraint on it. To say, okay, well, you have this amount of time to display your knowledge. How do you now get to the point where you can adequately display it in that 3 hours? And that is where part of it is learning how your brain works. So, I mean, I also tried various different study techniques. And I mean, we've been speaking a lot about like webs or the sort of higher abstract level thinking and how do you kind of get there. So a good example I like to do. So Margie, can you close your eyes, please? Okay. And this readers, those who aren't driving, you can also close your eyes. So I want you to think of a cat. Okay. Now, when I say cat, what do you think of?
A black cat.
But you didn't think of the word CAT.
No.
You didn't think of the connections. But now if I tell you dog, can you think of a dog?
Yes.
And I want you to think about how a dog and a cat are related. And how are they related?
They're both pets.
There we go. They maybe have both have paws, they both have a tail. So we can see from the sort of abstraction, and you guys can open your eyes.
I was like, do it for the rest of the podcast.
This is a visualization exercise. But the idea being that our brains don't think in words. Our brains have never really thought in words. Modern language is like a relatively new invention in terms of the biological history of humankind. And so we need to think of ways that we are better working with our biology as opposed to trying to override it and force all these acronyms. So, I mean, Margs, what's a book that you absolutely love to read, that you read like a million times?
Name of the Wind.
Name of the Wind. Love
Patrick
awesome. So can you tell me what happens on page 17?
Oh, good grief.
But you've read it a couple of times, right? This is what I tell students when they walk into my office and they say, but I've been studying so hard. I keep looking at the notes. I keep revising. But you were never going to remember this. Your brain is not designed for this sort of information. Your brain is largely designed in terms of relational things.
Yeah.
What is the relation between a cat and dog?
Yeah.
In that sense, your brain is probably one of the best supercomputers out there.
Yeah.
You can, in a set instant, generate images and related images and concepts from a single thought.
Yeah.
Without actually having to go through paragraphs of what are the attached lists to these thoughts.
Yes.
And so what I find with students is that when studying, they try and remove the context. With the Name of the Wind, you can't tell me what happens on page 17, but you can tell me the story of it.
Yes.
Your brain is designed to remember things in relation to one another. So if for the listeners at home, if I asked you, to go back to a time in your life that you can really easily recall.
Yeah.
It's often like birthdays, Christmases, or like some sort of special family event.
Yeah.
And I ask you to describe that, to sit in that moment, to sit in that experience. You'll tell me things about the color. You could probably say like maybe what you were wearing, who was there, what were the sounds around you.
Yeah.
Our brains are designed off relational stuff.
Yeah.
And so bringing that into your studying, and this is where I'm going to be the person that says, and this will have been every single LO teacher that you've had, mind maps. Mind maps are a great way of doing this. So, and I think they're often misconstrued as those awful mind maps where we've seen in high school that teachers told us we had to study.
Where it just is like chaos on the page.
Exactly. That was never the idea of a mind map. The idea of a mind map, so for those wanting a little bit of extra reference and reading for this podcast, is Tony Buzan.
Okay.
So he was one of the big proponents of it in the 90s. But his idea is that because this is actually how our brains work.
Yes.
You don't learn things like in a paragraph.
Yes.
You learn things relationally, episodically. So to join those two parts, particularly in your later exams, and they're also very useful in the technical exams,
yes,
you are forcing your brain to generate links between things.
Yes.
The relational aspects of why does this chapter on products or reserves and expenses go together?
Yeah.
What is the relationship between expenses and reserves, and what else do they tie to?
Yeah.
I always think of in the orange books, you have that statistical distribution map.
Yes.
Where it's like, if this...
I actually love that.
It's great.
Yes. It's
that's a mind map.
Yeah.
It's showing you how things are related to one another. The binomial, if sufficient n, tends towards the normal, right? So we're looking for those kind of things. So the mind map, that is much closer to how our brain works.
Yeah.
So, and particularly my brain in my sort of A311 CA1
newest names it's taken.
Exactly. I studied purely through mind maps. I had 50 pages, just a mind map per chapter. And then when trying to think about the content within a chapter, I would think about it as a story.
Yes.
Of what is the story of these
and how does it connect to other chapters, kind of thing. And I think that's actually really interesting, because I remember sort of a couple points there, but I remember when we were given our actuarial risk management notes, Steve said to us, read it like a novel.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, this is the worst novel I ever did. Because where's the
flavor? There
was no climax.
The emotional climax is me crying. It's when I'm not understanding.
I brought all of the characters.
Yeah.
But I think what he meant by that is that just read it and your brain connects things. And so I think that's a good way of approaching those later subjects.
Yes.
But also another thing which you said, which I think is really important that for listeners to know, is that you have to make some form of summary of the content.
Yeah.
Whether it's a mind map, whether it's an annotated summary, whatever works for you. But you cannot be reading over the notes again and again and again, because I had students who said to me, my study plan is to read through the notes 3 times. I'm like, that's a terrible study plan. You need a booklet, that, and maybe go back to the drawing board. Because there's too much. And what you need to do is, part of active studying is creating a summary and saying, okay, I'm going to create a summary and I'm going to make a good summary. And then I'm not going to go read the 50 pages that underpin the summary periodically, because it's efficient.
Exactly.
And so I think that's a really important sort of initial stage to doing those later subjects. But I think also something which I have seen, and I'd be interested to see whether you've seen, is that students also underplay the importance of the glossary.
Exactly that. Yeah.
And often there are questions where it says, define this.
Yes.
Or a question assumes that you understand the definition of something.
Yes.
And it's not going to explain it because it's in the glossary.
Yes.
And so one warning I would give to students from sort of actuarial risk management to the end of your board exams is don't neglect the glossary.
Yeah.
Because the glossary, like anything, well, like anything in the notes, colors in the context and the world of the space that you're trying to master. And
Exactly
I think students always like, oh, the glossaries at the end.
Yeah.
For people that didn't understand the context.